They found a locked room in the basement after 12 years. Sometimes the quietest houses are the ones that have heard the most. At the edge of a small Midwestern town, half hidden behind overgrown lilac bushes, stood the Collins family home. The locals called it the place time forgot. It wasn't haunted in the usual sense, no flickering lights, no ghostly figures at the window. But everyone who walked by felt the same uneasy pull, like the house itself was holding its breath. For 12 long years, no one had lived there. Not since the night the previous owners vanished from town without saying goodbye. When Daniel Collins drove up that gravel driveway in early spring, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just trying to start over. The layoff in Chicago had drained his savings. His marriage was tired, and the only inheritance left from his late father was this weather-beaten house in a town he'd sworn he'd never return to. Melissa, his wife, tried to sound hopeful as they unloaded boxes. Their teenage son Aaron scrolled on his phone, pretending not to notice the cracked shutters or the faint smell of mildew that drifted through the open door. From the road, it looked like any other forgotten house. Inside, it felt different. Too still, too cold, as if it remembered every argument and every secret it had ever contained. By nightfall, the family had settled in as best they could. Melissa wiped dust from the kitchen counters, humming to fill the silence. Daniel checked the furnace in the basement. Aaron unpacked just enough to call the room his. But when the lights flickered for the third time, and the hum from the basement seemed to rise and fall like breathing, Melissa paused mid-song. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Daniel smiled without looking up. "Old wiring," he said. Yet even he could feel it, the subtle vibration in the floor, the kind that doesn't come from pipes or power. Something deeper, something waiting. Daniel Collins had grown up in Mid-Ridge, but he hadn't meant to come back. Back then, the town had felt too small for him, the kind of place where every grocery store clerk knew your family history, where gossip traveled faster than weather fronts. His father, Robert, had been a machinist who rarely smiled, the sort of man who measured worth in what could be fixed with his own 2 hands. Daniel left at 19 for Chicago, swearing he'd never return except for funerals. Chicago had offered noise, anonymity, and ambition until the layoffs came. One pink slip later, he was driving a borrowed pickup full of memories he didn't want. Melissa sat beside him, quiet behind her sunglasses, while Aaron slept in the back seat with earbuds in. The trip took 6 hours, but it felt like moving backward in time. When they first pulled up to the house, Melissa tried to sound cheerful. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said. What she didn't say was that it looked sad. The siding had peeled down to gray paper, the porch sagged, and the air smelled faintly of iron. Daniel jiggled the old brass key in the lock until it gave way with a groan. The sound carried through the hallway like the house exhaling after years of holding its breath. Inside, dust floated in thick beams of light. There were footprints on the floor, small ones, leading halfway down the corridor before disappearing into shadow. Melissa told herself they belonged to raccoons, or maybe a stray cat. Still, she found herself brushing them away with her shoe. They spent the afternoon exploring. The living room ceiling bowed slightly. Its paint bubbled like old skin. The kitchen sink rattled when the water ran, and the smell that came from the faucet was metal and rot. Upstairs, the wallpaper had faded into strange shapes. One patch looked like a handprint reaching toward the ceiling. Aaron laughed when she pointed it out, but his voice cracked a little at the end. The basement was Daniel's favorite part. Concrete floors, exposed beams, and a workbench built by his father decades earlier. It was large, but not welcoming. The single overhead bulb threw weak light that barely reached the corners. He noticed a draft he couldn't place, a steady hum that seemed to come from behind the far wall. That night, while Melissa unpacked the kitchen boxes, Daniel went down again. He told himself he was checking the furnace, but he really just wanted to listen. There it was, the hum, low and constant, almost like a heartbeat. He crouched beside the wall, palm flat against the concrete. The vibration pulsed once, faint but real. When he came upstairs, his hand smelled like rust. Over the next few days, the Collinses tried to settle into small-town rhythm. Melissa volunteered at the library. Daniel began sanding the porch rail, and Aaron biked around until he found other teenagers, killing time behind the gas station. Everyone they met seemed friendly but cautious, like they were waiting to see whether the family would last. At the hardware store, an old man recognized Daniel's last name and smiled sadly. "You're back in the old Delaney house, huh?" he said. Daniel frowned. Delaney. My dad owned it. The man wiped his hands on his apron. Sure, after the Delaneys moved out. Strange folks. Didn't stay long. Then, softer, that basement always gave me the creeps. Melissa heard the same thing a day later at the bakery. The woman behind the counter lowered her voice and said, "I hope you blessed that place before moving in." When Melissa asked why, the woman just shook her head. Sometimes houses remember things. That night, Melissa woke to find Daniel standing by the window, staring into the yard. The moonlight caught the edge of his face. He looked younger and older all at once. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured. "This house, it sounds alive." The next morning they both laughed it off, but neither mentioned that they'd heard footsteps moving across the hallway sometime after midnight. Slow, deliberate, stopping outside Aaron's door. Aaron said it was probably the pipes. Melissa wanted to believe him. Daniel didn't answer. A week later, the family decided to start cleaning the basement together. They carried down old brooms, paint cans, and a radio that barely caught local stations. The air grew heavier with every step. Daniel switched on the light. It flickered 3 times before settling into a dim orange glow. They found relics from the past, a stack of yellowed newspapers from 2012, a jar of nails, and a child's shoe without laces. Melissa set the shoe aside and didn't mention it. When Aaron turned the radio dial, static filled the space. Then a brief voice cut through. "Underneath it all," before fading again. He laughed, pretending not to care, but goosebumps rose on his arms. Near the back wall stood an old shelving unit covered with cobwebs. Daniel reached behind it, feeling the draft again. colder this time. Something about the wall bothered him. It looked newer, smoother. He tapped his knuckle against it. The sound came back hollow. "Mom, listen to that," Aaron said. Melissa forced a smile. Probably a crawl space. But Daniel didn't answer. He kept knocking, each thud slower, more deliberate. Later that night, he dreamed of standing in that same spot. Only this time, the wall breathed back. It started as a draft, a small, cold breath that didn't belong. Daniel felt it every time he passed the back corner of the basement. He'd crouch, run his hand along the concrete, and swear the air was moving. The rest of the wall was solid and rough, but that section was smoother, newer. He told Melissa it was just a patch job, but the idea of a space behind it wouldn't leave his mind. On the third night, he brought down a flashlight and his father's old hammer. The shelves blocking the wall hadn't been touched in years. He moved them inch by inch, stirring up clouds of dust that tasted like metal. Behind them, the concrete was almost perfect, except for a faint outline running waist-high across the surface. A seam, thin and deliberate, like someone had drawn the shape of a door and tried to hide it. Daniel traced it with his fingertips. Paint flaked away, revealing gray steel beneath. He tapped it gently. The sound was hollow. It echoed too long. He stared for a while, not breathing, then stepped back. "Melissa," he called up the stairs. "Can you come down here for a second?" Her footsteps hesitated at the top step. "Why? What is it?" "Just come look." She descended halfway, arms crossed against the chill. The flashlight beam wobbled across the metal edge. "It's probably an old utility door," she said. "Why would someone cover it?" Daniel smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what I want to know." That night, neither of them slept well. The house seemed to settle louder than before. Pipes groaned, wood shifted, and the hum from below turned into something more rhythmic, not constant anymore, but pulsing, faintly timed like breathing through walls. Melissa tried to tell herself it was the furnace, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The next morning, Daniel called a friend from town, someone who did contracting work. The man was polite, but uneasy. When Daniel explained about the hidden door, there was a pause on the line. "What house did you say you were in?" "The one off Willow Creek Road. My dad's old place." Another pause. Then a low whistle. "That used to be the Delaney property, right?" "Yeah, before my dad bought it." The man cleared his throat. "You might want to be careful, tearing up that basement. Heard some strange stories about that place." Daniel frowned. "What kind of stories?" The man didn't answer. "Just strange ones." He hung up without saying goodbye. Melissa didn't like that call. "Maybe you should stop digging into this," she said over dinner. "It's just a door," Daniel said. "It's part of the house." She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Then promise me you'll wait. Call the city before you start breaking things. Make sure it's safe." He promised. But that night, when she went to bed, he didn't follow. Downstairs, Daniel set the flashlight on the floor and pressed his ear against the cold wall. Nothing at first. Then a faint knock, once, then twice. He jerked back, staring. His hand trembled as he held the light closer. There was no movement, No sound now, just the echo of his heartbeat in the dark. When he went upstairs, he locked the basement door for the first time. The next day, Melissa found him reading through the house's old deed. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Anything," he said. "Blueprints, permits, something that shows this part of the basement. It's not in any of these papers. So maybe it was added later. Then why cover it up?" He didn't look up, didn't smile. He was somewhere else already, lost in that question. That weekend, Aaron had a couple of friends over. Teenage curiosity works fast. When one of them heard there was a hidden wall in the basement, they begged to see it. Daniel reluctantly agreed. The kids joked nervously as they descended the steps, pretending not to be scared. The door's outline was more visible now, where Daniel had scraped away the paint. One of the boys, Tyler, reached out to touch it. "It's cold," he said. Aaron rolled his eyes. "It's concrete. Of course it's cold." "No," Tyler said, pulling his hand back. "It feels colder in the middle, like something's behind it." When the boys went home, Aaron asked quietly, "Dad, you're not really going to open it, are you?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Wouldn't you want to know what's behind it?" Aaron didn't answer. Melissa tried to distract him by suggesting they focus on the upstairs renovations, but Daniel's thoughts kept returning to that wall. He'd eat dinner in silence, then disappear downstairs. Sometimes she'd hear him talking softly, like he was reasoning with himself, or someone else. One night, she followed him down without warning. The air smelled different, damp and sharp, like metal and wet stone. Daniel didn't notice her. He was on his knees, scraping at the seams of the wall with a screwdriver. "Daniel!" Her voice cracked through the basement. He startled, turned toward her, and for a second she saw something in his eyes she didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" He exhaled shakily. "There's a handle. I can feel where it used to be." "Please," she said, stepping closer. "You're scaring me." He dropped the screwdriver. "I just want to know what's back there. That's all." She reached for his arm, but his skin was cold, almost clammy. She led him upstairs, locked the basement behind them, and hid the key. For 2 days, the hum stopped. The air felt lighter. They laughed again. Then, on the third night, when Daniel went to the kitchen for a drink, the basement light was on. The key she'd hidden was gone. When she found him the next morning, he was sitting on the bottom step, flashlight in hand, staring at the door. "I didn't open it," he said quietly. "Not yet." Melissa looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then who did?" By the end of that week, Melissa was done pretending everything was normal. Daniel spent hours staring at the wall, tracing its outline like it was a puzzle meant only for him. He barely ate, barely spoke. Every time she brought up calling someone to look at it, he'd say the same thing. "They'll just tell us to seal it again." She couldn't take the silence anymore. So she called the town clerk's office herself. The woman on the other end sounded cheerful until Melissa gave the address. 117 Willow Creek Road. Her tone shifted. Paper rustled. "Hold on a second. That property—" Another pause. "Wasn't that Delaney's place years ago?" Melissa hesitated. "Yes, I think so." The woman cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am, are you calling about another complaint? Another?" "Never mind," she said quickly. "I'll see what records we still have." She emailed Melissa an old blueprint an hour later. The basement plan stopped halfway across the foundation, just blank space where the sealed wall stood now. No door, no extra room, nothing. Melissa printed it, spread it on the kitchen table, and waited for Daniel to come upstairs. When he saw the gap in the drawing, his expression changed. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition, like something inside him had been confirmed. "So, it really was hidden," he murmured. That night, Melissa found a name scrawled on the blueprint margin. Harold Delaney, owner. She typed it into her phone. Old articles surfaced, most behind paywalls, but one short piece from 2013 still loaded. Local boy reported missing after storm floods Willow Creek area. No photo, no update. The boy's name was Ethan. Age 9. Last seen playing outside his family's home. Her hand shook as she scrolled. The date, July 18th, 2013. 12 years ago. When Daniel came back from the hardware store, she told him. He didn't blink. "Rumors," he said flatly. "Small towns always have them." But later, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him on the phone in the other room. "Frank Delaney, my name's Daniel Collins. I think my dad bought your family's old house." A long silence followed. Then Daniel's voice, softer. "I just want to ask about the basement." He listened, eyes dark, jaw tight. Then he said, "You knew about the door, didn't you?" Another silence. "What do you mean? Leave it alone?" He exhaled sharply. "Sir, what's behind it?" Click. The call ended. For the next 2 days, Daniel didn't talk about it. He didn't have to. The house did it for him. The hum came back stronger, vibrating through the pipes. Light bulbs flickered, even when the switches were off. At night, Melissa heard faint knocks from the floorboards below their bed, steady, even, 3 at a time. Aaron said the same thing, tapping in the basement around 3 a.m. When Melissa told Daniel, he just nodded. "I hear it too." "Then maybe we should go to a hotel," she said. His gaze stayed fixed on the basement door. "No, I think it's trying to tell us something." She stared at him. Daniel, it's a wall." He turned his head slowly, not for long. On Sunday afternoon, Daniel disappeared for several hours. When he came back, his hands were shaking. He told Melissa he'd driven to Cedar Falls to find Frank Delaney. "He's not well," Daniel said. "Lives in a trailer off Route 14. Wouldn't let me inside. But he told me something." Melissa waited. "He said his father built that room himself. Called it the quiet place. Used to lock Ethan inside when he misbehaved." Her stomach dropped. "You're joking." Daniel shook his head. "He said there was an accident. During a storm, water got in through the vents. The lock jammed. The boy, he couldn't finish. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Melissa whispered, 'So why seal it instead of calling the police?' He said his father couldn't face what he'd done. He walled it off. Told everyone Ethan ran away. And Frank. He was a teenager. He helped pour the concrete. That night, Melissa dreamt of water dripping. In her dream, she was the one sealed inside. She woke gasping, and for a second she thought she heard footsteps right beneath the bed. Downstairs, The basement light was glowing again. She went down barefoot, each step colder than the last. The air felt thick, like breathing through cloth. The metal door gleamed faintly under the bulb. She reached out, then stopped. Someone had written on it in dust, a single word drawn by fingertip. Please. The next morning, she showed Daniel. He stared at the word a long time before whispering, "It's condensation. Someone must have brushed it." But the letters were traced from the inside out. That was the day she started keeping her phone camera on her nightstand. By midweek, Daniel's obsession had turned to full-blown fixation. He ordered an endoscope camera online, the kind plumbers use to look inside pipes. When it arrived, he drilled a tiny hole into the cement near the hinge, ignoring Melissa's protests. He fed the cable through, watching the small screen in silence. For a moment, there was only darkness. Then the camera caught something pale, like fabric fluttering. It wasn't moving with air. It was swaying, gently, as if disturbed. Daniel pulled the cable out, fast. His knuckles were white. "What did you see?" Melissa asked. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "I think there's someone in there." Her heart pounded. "You mean remains?" He looked at her slowly. "No, I mean someone." That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain hammered the roof, and thunder rattled the windows. The lights flickered twice before going dark. Melissa lit a candle and called for Daniel, but he didn't answer. When she reached the basement stairs, she saw the flashlight beam flickering below. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the dark. "Daniel!" Her voice cracked. He didn't respond. She rushed down, holding the candle high. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. Daniel was standing by the door, breathing hard, holding the crowbar in both hands. The lock bolts were half cut. "Stop!" she shouted. He turned to her, sweat running down his neck. "He's in there, Melissa. I heard him." "Who?" "The boy. He's still in there." She dropped the candle, grabbed his arm, but the final hinge snapped before she could pull him away. The door groaned open, letting out a breath of air so cold it burned her throat. Inside, darkness moved like smoke. The first thing they noticed was the smell. It rolled out of the darkness like a living thing. Thick, stale, heavy with rust, and something faintly sweet, like old fruit left in the sun. It wasn't the smell of death, not exactly. It was older than that. Something that had once been human, long gone to dust, but never given permission to leave. Melissa gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Daniel just stood there, frozen in the doorway, flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam cut through layers of dust that hung in the air like mist. Every surface shimmered with fine particles, undisturbed for more than a decade. The room was smaller than he expected, maybe 8 feet across, 10 deep. The walls were concrete, painted over in dull beige, peeling in thin curls. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, long dead. The floor was bare except for a wooden chair in the center, its legs darkened with water stains. And in the far corner, a toy truck, red plastic, one wheel missing. Melissa's voice broke the silence. "Daniel, what is this?" He didn't answer. He crouched by the toy, brushing off a layer of dust with the back of his hand. Beneath it was a tiny handprint, perfectly preserved in the grime. His throat tightened. It's a child's room. Along the wall behind the chair, Melissa saw markings, hundreds of short vertical lines scratched into the paint. Not random, not vandalism. Counted. Tracked. Someone marking days. Her hands started shaking. There must have been someone locked in here. Daniel turned toward her, face pale. I told you, it's him. He noticed something else near the floor, a dark shape against the baseboard. It was small, square, almost hidden under the dust. He brushed it clean. A recorder, cassette style, silver, the kind they sold at gas stations 15 years ago. He pressed play. Static filled the room. A hiss, low and constant. Then, faintly, a voice. Please, don't go. Melissa staggered backward. Oh my God. Daniel pressed stop, then play again, as if he didn't believe it. Please, don't go. The sound was childlike, weak, barely more than a whisper. Daniel sat down hard on the floor. He was alive in here, he said quietly. Long enough to call for help. Melissa's mind spun. But how? How is that even possible? He didn't answer. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second she thought she saw something on the far wall, writing, faint and curved. When the light steadied, she realized it wasn't written with ink. It was drawn with something darker. The words read, He hears me. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel, we need to leave. Call the police. But he just stared at the wall, lips moving silently, as if reading something invisible beneath the words. When she finally pulled him out, he resisted. You don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. It's my father's fault. What are you talking about? He bought this place right after they sealed it. He must have known. She shook her head. Daniel, that doesn't make sense. But somewhere in her gut, it did. When the sheriff's team arrived hours later, they sealed off the basement. Cameras flashed. Reporters stood outside the fence, their microphones trembling in the wind. Detective Hollister's report would later describe the room as an unregistered space consistent with unlawful confinement. The markings, the toy, the chair, and the tape were all collected as evidence. No remains were found. But Hollister also wrote something unusual in his notes, a single line near the end. While photographing the far wall, light meter registered motion. No source identified. Forensics took the recorder for analysis. The casing was corroded, but the tape inside remained intact. It contained 23 minutes of sound. The first 9 were silence, only soft breathing. Then a boy's voice. Dad. Another pause. Dad, it's dark. The boy sniffled, whispering, Please, don't go. At minute 12, water could be heard dripping. At 17, scraping. At 21, a faint knocking rhythm. Then static. Hollister turned the recording off halfway through. Get this to the lab, he said quietly. Melissa couldn't stay in the house that night. She booked a motel room outside town. Daniel refused to go. He sat in the basement until dawn, staring at the open door. Every few minutes, he swore he heard something, a shuffle, a sigh, the sound of bare feet on concrete. He told himself it was the old pipes, but once, when he blinked, he saw the toy truck move an inch across the floor. When the morning light filtered down, the room looked empty again. He finally closed the door and locked it with a new padlock. He told himself it was over. It wasn't. Over the next week, the house began to change. Melissa started finding small puddles of water in strange places, by the basement door, near the sink, under their bed. Aaron said his phone alarm kept going off at 3:12 a.m. every night, though he never said it. Daniel spent hours rereading his father's journals, trying to find any mention of the house. On the third night, he found a folded letter tucked between pages. It was dated August 2013, to whoever owns this house after me. It said, "If you hear him, don't answer. He's not asking for help. He's remembering." Melissa showed the letter to Detective Hollister. "So you think Daniel's father knew?" she asked. Hollister rubbed his temples. "We can't prove that, but if he did, he was smart enough to leave it alone." She glanced toward the hallway window. Outside, Daniel was digging by the porch. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Hollister looked at her. "Would you?" That night, the basement door creaked open by itself. The padlock was still attached, but the bolt had been snapped clean. Daniel didn't hear it. He was already downstairs. The police kept the property sealed for 3 days. Yellow tape fluttered across the porch, and curious neighbors watched from behind curtains. Melissa stayed at her sister's place in town, calling Daniel every few hours. He always said the same thing, "I'm fine." But he wasn't. Each night after the officers left, he slipped back inside. He said it was to make sure they didn't miss anything. But really, he couldn't stand being away. He'd sit at the kitchen table with the recorder in front of him, staring at it like he could will it to explain itself. When the power flickered, he didn't flinch anymore. By the end of that week, the forensics report arrived. It was thorough, but strange. There were no fingerprints except Daniel's and Melissa's. No trace of decomposition. No blood, but along the upper section of the concrete wall, just under the paint, technicians found salt deposits, thick and irregular, as if seawater had leaked through stone. There was no logical explanation for it. The autopsy department cross-checked the DNA from the hair in the vent. It matched Ethan Delaney, the boy who had disappeared 12 years earlier. The state lab confirmed it twice. That should have been closure, but it wasn't, because something about the timeline didn't fit. The corrosion on the recorder's battery panel was newer than 12 years old. 3, at most. Detective Hollister brought the news in person. He sat with Melissa in the motel lobby, his uniform collar still damp from rain. "Who's been in that basement during the last 3 years?" he asked. Melissa shook her head. "No one. The house was empty until we came back." "Not exactly," he said, sliding a printed page across the table. It was an old utility log. "There were power fluctuations registered to your meter in February 2022. Minimal draw, only basement circuits. Someone turned those lights on for 2 nights. Her stomach dropped. "It must have been squatters. Kids, maybe." He sighed. "Maybe. But we didn't find footprints older than a few weeks. Whoever was down there cleaned after themselves." She stared at him. "You think it's still happening?" He didn't answer. Daniel refused to speak with police anymore. He said they were twisting things. When Melissa asked about the electricity records, he got defensive. "You think I did this?" he snapped. "You think I'd hide something like that from you?" She backed away. "I think you're not sleeping, and it's changing you." That night, she checked his workbench. Inside a drawer were tools smeared with gray dust and a small notebook filled with measurements, depth of walls, thickness of plaster, humidity levels by hour. On one page he had written the same phrase several times, "He remembers me." Melissa drove to the motel again, but by the second night, guilt pulled her back. When she opened the front door, the air felt colder than the rain outside. Daniel's boots were by the basement steps, but the light was off. She whispered his name. No answer. She descended halfway before hearing it, faint music, tinny, like a lullaby leaking from an old speaker. It was the recorder running again. The tape clicked and rewound itself, then played, "Please, don't go." Then silence. She turned the light on. The room was empty. The recorder sat on the bottom step. Batteries removed. By morning, Daniel was in the kitchen, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from too much coffee. "I think there's another door," he said. Melissa blinked. "Another what?" "Behind the first room, the concrete near the right wall. There's resonance. I felt it." She slammed her cup down. "Stop this. It's over. They confirmed the boy. It's done." He shook his head slowly. "No, that voice wasn't 12 years old. The tape's newer. Somebody else was there." Melissa didn't know which scared her more, the possibility he was right, or that he wasn't. 2 days later, the Collins family made local news again. A group of teens broke into the property after seeing videos online. One of them streamed live from the basement, laughing until the feed cut out. The last few seconds showed the boy turning his phone towards the open doorway and whispering, "There's writing again." Police found them minutes later, shaken but unhurt. Every photo they took showed the same thing written in the dust across the inside wall. "Let me out." The next morning, Daniel disappeared. Melissa filed a missing person report before noon. Hollister organized a search, but no one had seen Daniel leave. His truck was still in the driveway. The only clue was his flashlight on the basement floor, beam pointing at the wall as if dropped mid-step. When Hollister shined his own light, he noticed something subtle. Fresh plaster lines tracing a new rectangle beside the old one. Smaller, almost like a door recently closed. He tapped it once. The sound came back hollow. The police left before dark, promising to return with a ground-penetrating radar. Melissa stayed behind, pacing the living room, clutching the phone. The house creaked softly around her, settling into its old rhythm. Then the humming started again. Louder this time. It came from below, pulsing through the vents. A deep vibration, steady as breath. She followed it to the basement steps. The padlock she'd replaced that morning was gone. The door stood open. Inside, the flashlight beam flickered once against the far wall. There were new tally marks scratched into the paint. She counted quickly. 13. The same number of years since the Delaney's had moved away. Melissa whispered his name. Something whispered back. Detective Hollister didn't sleep that night. Something about the look in Melissa's eyes when she reported Daniel missing wouldn't leave him. He drove back to 117 Willow Creek Road before dawn, the mist rising off the fields like smoke. The air was colder than it should have been for early May. The porch light was still on, the door half open. Inside, the house felt empty but awake. "Mrs. Collins," he called. No answer. He stepped carefully through the hallway, flashlight in hand. The beam slid across framed photos, all turned face down on the mantel. The basement door was wide open. Cold air drifted up like a draft from an open grave. When he reached the bottom step, his boots echoed. The air smelled metallic, heavy. On the floor lay Melissa's phone, its flashlight still on, pointed toward the corner where the sealed wall used to be. It wasn't sealed anymore. A jagged hole gaped where the new plaster had been cut through, rough, uneven, like someone clawed it open from the inside. Hollister crouched, shining the light through the opening. It led into another chamber, smaller, darker. The beam caught on something hanging from a hook. A coat. Daniel's coat. He called it in. Within minutes, deputies swarmed the property, lights strobing across the yard. They cordoned off the house again, though the neighbors had already started to gather. By sunrise, word spread. The Collins house had claimed another. Inside the new chamber, they found a second chair, identical to the first. The same tally marks covered the wall, though the last few were drawn in what looked like wet rust. Beneath them, scrawled unevenly, a sentence, "He forgives me now." The forensics team cataloged everything, but the report would never explain how the air inside was warm to the touch, or why Daniel's fingerprints were on both sides of the wall, even though no one had broken through until that morning. Melissa was found in the living room, sitting upright on the couch, her eyes open but distant. She wasn't injured, but she couldn't speak. The paramedics described her as responsive but disassociated. When they tried to lead her outside, she whispered something barely audible. "He's not gone. He's still counting." Hollister stayed behind after the others left. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He reviewed every photo of the basement wall taken that morning, scanning each inch for patterns. Then he saw it. Faint lines in the dust, curved and repeated near the floorboards. He enlarged the image. The markings weren't random. They spelled a name. Robert, Daniel's father. The detective went back to the station and pulled the file from storage, the one listing all former owners. Robert Collins had bought the property from Frank Delaney in late 2013, barely 2 months after Ethan vanished. Hollister hadn't thought much of it before. Plenty of properties change hands after tragedies. But this sale was different. The records showed a cash transaction, no inspection, no agent, no paperwork beyond the deed. When he called the county archives to request copies, the clerk hesitated. "That's funny," she said. "That folder's been flagged. Looks like it was updated recently." "By who?" "Doesn't say, but the signature looks like your missing guy, Daniel Collins." Hollister drove straight to the county warehouse where the old files were kept. The clerk handed him the deed. Someone had penciled notes in the margin fresh enough that the graphite still smudged. He knew about the room. Dad knew. And below it, he used it again. The detective felt a chill crawl up his neck. If Daniel was right, that meant someone, maybe Robert Collins himself, had reopened the sealed room after the Delaney's left. But for what? Back at the Collins house, a new team continued searching. One of the officers called out from the basement, "Detective, you'd better see this." Hollister descended. The air was colder again. The officer pointed at the wall opposite the hole. "We lifted a panel behind the insulation. There's a box embedded in the concrete." They pried it open. Inside were 3 items: a key, rusted and bent, a cassette labeled August 4th, 2014, and a folded piece of paper with handwriting that matched Robert Collins' old tax forms. Hollister unfolded it carefully. The words were short, uneven. "He's quiet now. I kept him. I had to. It wasn't my fault." The tape was played at the lab later that evening. It began with the sound of footsteps and a man breathing heavily. Then a voice, Robert's. "He doesn't sleep anymore. Keeps whispering under the floor. Says he wants his brother." Silence. Then a faint knock. Once. Twice. Robert whispered, "I can't bury him again. I can't." The tape ended abruptly with a clatter, as if the recorder had fallen. When Hollister returned to the house the next morning, the demolition team was already there. The county planned to tear down the basement completely, fill it with concrete, and sell the lot. He walked through one last time before they started. The walls were stripped bare, the air empty. As he turned to leave, his boot brushed against something under the dust. A toy truck, red plastic, one wheel missing. He crouched, staring at it for a long moment. Then he looked toward the open door, half expecting someone to be standing there. No one was. But faintly, from somewhere deep beneath the floor, he heard tapping. Slow, deliberate. 3 times. He left the house without looking back. The Collins property was demolished that fall. Melissa never recovered enough to give a full statement. She moved to Wisconsin with her sister, refusing interviews, changing her last name. Aaron stayed silent, too, though classmates later said he avoided basements for the rest of high school. Detective Hollister retired the next spring, but once, during a late interview for a regional crime podcast, the host asked him what case stayed with him the most. He smiled faintly and said, "Willow Creek." Then, after a pause, he added, "Some houses keep secrets because they're protecting you from them. Some just don't want to be alone." For months after the demolition, people in Midridge tried to forget. They said the Collins case was just another small-town tragedy, a family broken by stress, bad luck, and an old house that should have been condemned long before anyone ever moved back in. The new concrete foundation was poured, leveled, and left to cure under the summer sun. On paper, the lot at 117 Willow Creek Road was finally clean. But clean doesn't mean empty. Construction workers refused to stay after dark. They said the generator lights flickered even when the power was steady. One man claimed to hear a boy humming under the soil while he shoveled. Another quit midweek after seeing a handprint pressed into freshly poured concrete, small, unmistakably child-sized, and warm to the touch. The project manager dismissed it as superstition. By late August, the lot was fenced off and forgotten again. Detective Hollister retired that year. He never spoke publicly about what he really found on the final night before the house came down. But his colleagues noticed something changed in him. He stopped going to church, started walking instead. Long, slow walks through town at dusk, as if searching for something that refused to stay buried. In an unpublished journal entry found later among his files, he'd written, "The sound doesn't leave. You think it's gone until everything else is quiet. Then it starts again. 3 knocks. Always 3. He died 5 years later of heart failure. The paramedics found his TV on board, paused at a local news report about redevelopment plans for Willow Creek Road. In the background of that broadcast, right as the camera panned over the empty lot, a faint tapping could be heard through the audio. The reporter never noticed. Melissa tried to rebuild a life in Wisconsin. She found part-time work at a daycare, rented a small house near the river, and told people her husband had died in an accident. The doctors called her trauma situational dissociation. She called it survival. Every few months, a reporter or documentary producer tracked her down, asking for interviews. She always declined. But one woman who cleaned her home near the end said Melissa would sometimes wake up screaming around 3:08 p.m., run to the basement door and listen, not out of fear, but expectation, like she knew something was coming. Aaron grew up quiet. He never talked about that house, never mentioned his father. But in his college dorm, he kept a small red toy truck on his shelf. He told his roommate it was from his childhood, but never said more. And the town moved on. The field at the end of Willow Creek grew tall with weeds. Developers promised to build a row of new homes there, but the permits kept stalling. Each time they tried to drill new foundations, water seeped up from underground, clear at first, then tinted brown. The geologists said it was mineral runoff. Locals said it was memory. Sometimes, on cold autumn nights, people driving past the old lot swear they see a light flicker beneath the ground, like a bulb still swinging on its wire. And if you park there long enough, windows down, engine off, you might hear it. The faint scrape of a chair leg against concrete, followed by 3 slow knocks. No one stays to listen for a 4th. What happened inside that basement isn't supernatural. It's something worse. It's what happens when guilt grows roots, when secrets get poured into concrete, and when silence lasts long enough to feel like safety. Every town has a story like this, whether they admit it or not. Sometimes it's a missing person. Sometimes it's a locked door nobody wants to open. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that something evil lives in the dark, but that someone once put it there, believing the dark could keep it. Some walls hold heat. Some hold history. And some, no matter how many times you rebuild over them, still remember the sound of the last voice that spoke inside. If you thought this story was unsettling, just wait until you hear what was uncovered next. A demolition crew tearing down an abandoned hospital found something sealed behind the walls. Something that shouldn't have been there, and something no one was ever supposed to see. That story is coming soon, so if you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe to Last Seen, the place where every story feels too real to be fiction. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when a new mystery drops. Because some of these stories you'll want to hear in the daylight, and others you'll wish you hadn't heard at all. Subscribe, like the video if you made it this far, and tell us in the comments, would you have opened that door